Okay. Right. Welcome back. So this week we're talking about finance. It's going to be a real quick crash course. These last 4 weeks are just topics that we decided on at the beginning of the semester. So I want to make this video real short and sweet. A few housekeeping notes. The midterm is worth 20% of your grade, and it's essentially just like a response paper with like an extra paragraph. So it's just a little bit longer than a response paper, but it's 20% of your grades. That's 2 letter grades. So it's like the most important response paper. So please get that to me when you can. Take your time with it. And the other thing I want to remind you of is discussion boards. The discussion boards are a way to extend our class. Since I don't have a chance to actually engage with you, the engagement that we get to do as a class happens in the discussion boards. Those are on Blackboard. On the left, there's a column with all the things, and one of the things is discussion boards. That's where those are at. If you haven't been doing that, it's a real easy way also to boost your grade, because the only requirement is that you do 2 per week and that it's relevant. So there's no requirement on length. Write as much or as little as you want. It doesn't have to be an answer to a question. It can be a question itself. If there's something related about finance that I don't cover in this video and doesn't get answered in the content, ask it in the discussion board, and that counts as one of your 2 posts. 1 post gets you 80% of that grade. 2 posts gets you 100% of that grade. So please make sure you're taking advantage of that. And if you missed a week, you can go back and do it now. It's okay. That's housekeeping things from my side. Please keep me updated on how things are going with you. Still holding office hours on Tuesdays, but I'm also available throughout the week. So if there's another time you want to touch base, let me know. Send me an email, please. Okay, so that's housekeeping. Okay, so for the readings for this week, one of them is a video. That link will send you to the last 10 minutes. It's an hour-long program, but just that last segment at the end is only about 10 minutes. That's talking about like existing mutual aid programs going on right now, particularly in Brooklyn and in Seattle. So just that last 10 minutes is the whole thing. And then there is a paper there that's 15 pages. I only want you to read the first 3 pages. You're welcome to read the whole thing if it's interesting to you. Caroline is a fantastic economist. So and person. So I recommend it if you're interested in it. Please, yes, enjoy. But as far as what I want you to have looked at, it's really just that first 3 pages. So that last 10 minutes of the Democracy Now! Episode are about mutual aid, and the paper written by Caroline Hassan is about alternative finance, informal finance, essentially. So the readings today are all about alternate forms of finance than the ones that we usually talk about. So the video for this week is just like a crash course in standard by the book finance, to introduce you to some of the terms and concepts, so that when we get to the discussion board or the response papers, the questions are, what types of alternate finance do you think is useful? What are aspects of alternate finance that you think are helpful? What are aspects of alternate finance that you think are not helpful? Or likewise, towards this material, what are aspects of this that are suspect to you? What are aspects of this that you like, are reliable, you think are useful to you? Any of those types of questions, and the kind of things that we can deal with for this week. Okay, so let's get to it. All right, so finance. When we're talking about finance, we're talking about how do we finance endeavors? Where does money come from so that we can make more of it, essentially? So when we're talking about a loan, when someone is thinking about a loan, we're talking about an asset that is also a liability. So this is going back to week 8 and a little bit week 9 review stuff. An asset that is also a liability. So it's, if I take out a loan, then I get that cash, but I also have to pay it back. So that cash is the asset, and the part where I have to pay it back, that's that liability. So an asset, remember, is what? It's something we own. A liability is something owned by somebody else. Right. So as an asset that's also a liability, another way to think about a loan is borrowing from the future. So if I take out a loan, then I get this cash, but I have to pay it back in the future. So I am increasing my ability to consume now by taking out a loan now, but I'm going to have to pay it back in the future. So I'm decreasing my consumption later. So if I take out $50, no interest, just I borrow $50 right now, then that increases my consumption power, my spending power by $50. If, however, if I have to pay it back next month and I get a paycheck for $100, then that decreases my spending by $50 because I borrowed 50 now, I have to pay it back next time, another $50 then. So instead of getting that whole $100 next period, I only get to spend 50 of it because 50 of it had to go back to the person I borrowed from first period. Right? It's fairly straightforward, really. But it also is at this point pretty value free. And by value free, what I mean is that there's no normative content to this. Like it might make sense if I have no money now and I'm going to have $100 next month, it might make sense for me to borrow $50 now. And then I can pay back the $50 next month and have another $50 to spend. I don't have money now, but I will have it in the future. So that might make sense. Right. So moving right along. Feel free to pause at any time. Stop, collect your thoughts. If you have any questions, put them in the discussion boards. Okay. All right, so principal is, the word that we use for the original amount of the loan. So if I take out a $50 loan, the principal is $50. Right? So it's just the original amount of the loan. But because most loans have interest, it's not the whole amount that needs to be repaid. So the way I'm going to define an interest rate even is, there you go, the price of each dollar not yet repaid. So if you think about a $50 loan, just to make things easy, 1% interest, then that means that for every time period that passes, the cost of holding each dollar is 1 cent. So let me see if I can. How would I be able to do this? Let me try. So if I have a $50 loan, what does that look like? Oh, I can see that. Maybe you can see it too. So I have a $50 loan. That's the principal. $50 is the principal. If the interest rate is 1%, we know that 1% is per 4 cent 100 for every 100. 1 for every 100. So if we convert it into a decimal point, then 1% is 0.01. And in the world of money, 1 is $1, and 0.01, that's 1 cent, $1 or 1 cent. So we have 1 cent for every dollar must be added on. So the price of each dollar not yet paid. So if I have a $50 loan and I pay it back right away, this is how credit cards function. If I take out $50 on my credit card and I pay it back right away, then I don't get any interest accumulated. I don't have to pay for any of the $50 that I borrowed. I just paid it back right away. If I take out $50, however, and I don't repay any of it, then by the end of that pay period, I'm going to have to pay back 1 cent for every dollar that I took out. So I'm going to end up having to pay back an additional 50 cents for this $50 loan, right? If I don't pay back any of it. We'll revisit this in an addendum somewhere. If it's tricky, let me know here, also in the discussion boards, a way to use that, one of those posts. And then another example of an interest rate and how much you would have to add back if you didn't pay it back. Okay, clear? Yes, no? No. we'll try it again in this next thing. So compound. So when you have a credit card, it's sort of like you're pre-approved. When you have a credit card with a $1,000 limit, for instance, that doesn't mean that you have taken out $1,000. It means that you could take out $1,000. But if you take out that $1,000 and you don't pay it back immediately, then interest rate will be applied. So what we call that is compound. So compounding interest means that after every time period, a year or a month, the interest is going to be calculated and added on. So if I have that $50 loan and I don't pay it back right away, it's 1% interest. So at the end of that first time period, I have the $50 principal plus a compounded 50 cents of interest. So the next pay period, if I still don't pay it back, then I'm going to have that 1% interest charge on every dollar not yet repaid, which now includes that extra 50 cents, right? So this, as the interest compounds, as it accumulates, the total amount of dollars not yet repaid increases. So the interest that gets compounded increases in size, even though the interest rate has not changed. It's still the same price for every dollar taken out. It's just that you're now taking out more dollars because you have this interest added on. And so that interest adding on is what we talk about when we're talking about compounding. Okay, so that's like the personal side of what it looks like to us when we're taking out loans. I want to get into a little bit of the business and banking side of it. I encourage you to stop here, pause here, go back through these definitions, see if you understand them, and if you don't, post a question to the discussion board. Cool. Okay, moving on. Leverage. Leverage is a loan backed by debt. It's getting tricky. So you'll remember, I hope, from, well, let me fix this first. Okay, so you'll remember, I hope, from when we were talking about money and how money works. The way that it works is it's frequently debt financed. So when a bank gives out a loan, it's different from a credit card company, but same general idea. But when the bank gives out a loan, that becomes, for me, if I'm holding the loan, it's an asset that's also a liability. It's an asset. I have this loan, but it's a liability because I have to pay it back. That liability owned by someone else is owned by the bank. So on their balance sheet, even though they're less that cash because they gave the cash to me, they have also an asset, which is that they own my debt. I owe them that money that I borrowed. They own that money that I borrowed. Okay, so it's their asset. Now, because they own that debt, a couple things can happen. They can use that as an asset against which they can make additional loans. Or if I take that loan and pay it to somebody else and it goes into another bank, that bank can issue out additional loans on that asset. So I have $50 cash, I pay it to my friend Michael, and Michael puts it into Michael's bank. So Michael's bank is now holding on to that whole asset, the whole asset part. I still have the liability to my bank. The whole asset part is now in another bank. And that bank can now loan out from that additional loaned money, right? Okay. So, and then by creating a loan, that bank will also generate a new asset on which it can loan additional funds. So in this way, a $50 loan becomes $50 available to loan in multiple different places, from my original bank, from Michael's bank, and again to Michael's bank once they've actually loaned it out and created a new asset. If this is feeling a little bit tough, go back to that those videos, the film about money, and see if that helps address things. If not, post that question in the discussion board for this week or week 8. Spread it around. Okay, so it's loan backed by debt. So when we talk about the housing or the crisis of 2008, 2009, part of that story of how we had such a big bank failure is that we had loans on top of loans, and we were making riskier and riskier loans. We'll talk about riskiness in a little bit. But we were making riskier and riskier loans. Banks were saying, okay, I'll give you money even though I really don't think that you're going to pay it back. And when one person failed, it was like a whole house of cards. Like if somebody doesn't default on their debt, then all of these other liabilities can't be paid. There's just a domino effect of liabilities that can't be paid because one person wasn't able to pay theirs. And it happened in general because a lot of risky assets were being offered. And it meant that, when we think about the bank has the ability to lend out 90% of its assets, but a lot of those aren't actually going to be paid back, then that's where we have to worry about a bank run of a different type. It's not people just showing up and asking for their money necessarily, but it has, but that the assets of the people who are investing in the bank and financial assets are being defaulted on by the bank itself. So if we have a retirement account at the bank and the bank has been defaulted on because it's made risky loans and those loans aren't being repaid, and the bank was planning on paying our retirement account off of those loans, when those loans aren't repaid, the bank can't pay our retirement, which is a problem because for a lot of people, you think, well, I'm going to let the bank hold on and manage my money. That's like the safest place to put it, right? But it turns out because the banks were making some risky decisions, it wasn't actually the safest place to put people's money. So people lost a lot, houses, retirement accounts, etc., because of the bank's financial mismanagement. Okay. Largely based on leverage. Okay, so that's that part. Sweet. Okay, so I also want to distinguish between bonds, which are interest earning assets. So if I have a government bond, I buy it for $50, for instance, but I know that based on the interest rate that it's providing me, so I buy a government bond, that basically means that the government is taking a loan from me. I'm giving them $50 so that they repay me my $50 and interest on top of that in the future. Right? So they're interest earning assets. Bonds governments can issue them, and so can companies. These are different from stocks. Little friend. We're getting through. There we go. That was just a break. I wanted to give you a little break. Okay, cool. Can you see it? You can see it. Okay, so bonds are interest earning assets. Fairly reliable, usually low interest. If we're buying them from a government, we believe that our government is not going to default and be bankrupt. We can feel pretty good about this. This is why when we're talking about money, week 8, week 9 stuff, midterm stuff, governments can use debt to finance their purchases, because all they do is they finance it by future debt. They just issue more debt to people in their own government and roll it forward. It's like using a credit card to pay off another credit card. And as long as the interest rates are low and the government is stable, we can generally be assured that the government will be able to issue new debt in the future. Different from a person who uses a credit card to pay a new credit card. We usually, at some point, our credit goes down when we do that. I think, though. Okay. And then, but for a government, it ends up usually working fine. although usually is a funny word when you talk about social sciences. Actually, might be a point of contention. Another thing you might want to ask is it okay for a government to finance its purchases of debt? I don't think I have seen actually a lot of responses about that so far. Um, so maybe this is a good time to talk about that. Does a government is it okay for a government to finance their spending with debt? Let me know. Okay, so bonds, that's bonds. Stocks are assets that are characterized by ownership and payouts. So when you own a stock, you should also receive a payout, usually in the form of dividends or whatever. But it's not at the same reliable interest rate. There's not a set price of each dollar that you're getting. It has more to do with the performance of the company. Okay. So, and it also has to do, there's some amount of like, depending on the type of stock that you hold, there's some amount of voting power that you often get by holding on to stocks. Yeah, I'm gonna leave that there. Yeah, I'm gonna leave that all there. The only thing I'll add to it is just like anything, if the interest rate is the price of each dollar not yet repaid. So if my interest rate, I have this $50 loan and I have a 1% interest rate. So that means that I have 50 cents after that first period. And it means that after that second period, I'm gonna have to pay, let's see, I guess 51 and half a cent. So it's accumulating, but slowly. If I have a 10% interest rate, the price goes up quite a bit in this case. Then that means that after that first period, I'll have, instead of having to repay $50, I'll have to repay $55. And then after that second period, instead of having to repay $55 if I don't repay anything, then I'll have to repay, right, $60.50. So, which is already, after that second period, a $9 difference between the first and the second loan, between a 1% interest rate and a 10% interest rate, right? So we expect that people pay off debt more quickly when it has a higher interest rate. At the same time, it is harder to repay a loan with a higher interest rate. So they might want to repay it more quickly, but they may not actually have the funds coming in. So whether or not it makes sense to take out a loan really depends on what you think the return is. And that is for a let me rephrase. Okay, so one way of thinking about taking out a loan is if it's optional, right? If it's like I have what I need right now, I could do buy with a little bit more, or I want to finance a business endeavor. The question is, do you think that you will make more on every dollar that you invest than you're going to have to pay by not repaying that loan right away, given that's going to take a little bit of time for that to come to fruition? So it's a gamble. It is a gamble. And there's no secret super financial code to doing exactly the right thing. That's why insider trading, like, so having secrets and sharing, it's like peeking at people's cards at the poker table. That's not allowed, but it does happen. And if you're not doing that, you got to read the tea leaves. Like, there's just not a whole lot else you can do, although people do spend a lot of time and energy trying to find the right perfect financial financial algorithm. And often, a lot of times, they work for a while and then don't. And that tends to be the nature of the financial system, is it's subject to highs and lows, which has to do with sort of the supply demand side, which we can maybe, which I think is too much for this week, but we can maybe look at and review. Actually, that sounds good. And review at the end of the semester. Unless you want to ask about it now. You might be able to think about it as related to scarcity and manufactured scarcity. The relationship between what people want and what they get has a lot to do with the stock market. Okay, so that's one side of it. So the one side of it is I'm going to make an investment. Does it make sense for me to do this? The other side of it is when our needs, our basic needs, are not being met, and we don't have enough income, we often also use credit or loans for that. And it's harder because while it might be necessary to keep our bodies alive and safe, it doesn't necessarily reassure the same kind of return. There's no necessary guarantee that there will be a monetary return towards feeding myself. Certainly, if I don't feed myself, I'm not going to be able to do good work, and I might not survive, but it doesn't necessarily come back in a monetary return. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be able to pay my compounding interest rate down. That's trickier. So that is where the sort of alternate finance comes in. There are many ways that alternate finance happens. One way that is talked about in development, and sorry about that. Just to finish this up, also what types of interest rates are offered to people has to do with credit worthiness, is what we often refer to it as, but it also has a lot to do with discrimination. So next week, when we talk about discrimination, that will be part of that puzzle. But for now, just knowing that, like, in addition to whether or not I have what I need, the type of interest rate that I'm going to get may be, may be different depending on the person, right? And not necessarily for like legally defensible ways. Okay. Okay, so one thing that came to the fore in development in the past couple decades, development in terms of helping low-income countries become high-income countries, was this idea of microfinance. And microfinance essentially functions the way that finance does, but the idea is that it was going to give smaller loans to people who can't afford sort of basic things, right? So we're giving smaller loans. They don't need to be as big, and because they aren't as big, we're going to offer them at better interest rates. But it ultimately is functioning in exactly the same way. It's operated by banks and NGOs, whatever. How does this? Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so that is right. Microfinance, small loans held by NGOs and banks. Non-governmental, or NGOs are non-governmental organizations. Usually nonprofits, but not necessarily. Okay. Great. So that's what microfinance is. Neither of your articles are talking about microfinance except for Caroline Hussain's article is talking about something that happens that is not microfinance, other than microfinance. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So she doesn't define it. She just talks about this alternative finance as different from this. So what this is essentially big finance, just smaller amounts, lower interest rates. Okay, cool. And it became very popular. I guess not that long ago, like in the past few decades. So there was a big push towards microfinance. What Carolyn's paper is talking about is very similar to the types of things that happen in SDI. So when we're talking about the Shack Dwellers International, that video about solar energy, right? So part of the way that scheme works is they have local community structure investing, local community investing structures. And when SDI enters a community or talks to another community and has them start their own finance structure, it's a little bit more um, uh, yeah, there's a little bit more structure to it than is described in the communities that Carolyn is looking at. But it's the same kind of knowledge and it's the same kind of basis of the knowledge. So this is not from the World Bank, it's from communities realizing that just in the same way that a bank can hold, only 10% of its actual assets and loan the rest out, the communities can function in the same way. That on their own, they don't have a whole lot of money, but if they put it all together, they can loan it out person by person at very low interest rates, just to cover the cost of managing the money and invest in their community that way, right? To this extent that community investment requires dollars sometimes. So that's the kind of work that Carolyn is talking about. It's a little bit different than mutual aid. Well, it's definitely different than mutual aid, but what I want you to pay special attention to is the way that we talk about enforcement. So when we're talking about an economic system, it's a method of production and a method of allocation. And that the allocation, the distribution, who gets what, is not only a system of, well, you're paid wages and then you can buy the things, but also how is that enforced? Like, how do we keep that going? So this finance structure is enforced by a legal system that has lots of loopholes. There is a judicial system that's attached to it. And it is very top-down in structure. The way that communities organize banking structures and the way that Caroline describes is not based on this type of structure. And in fact, it is because this type of structure is based in a top-down hierarchical format that is not well trusted by the communities that use informal finance. So if you're reading that one, think about, how does this work? How does this function? What is the method of enforcement? Yeah, okay. And to that end, thinking about social capital. So capital, like capital goods, capital refers to anything that is used to make more. So how do we increase what we have? How do we develop? So physical capital is like machinery and things that we use to build things. Social capital is like having access to productive endeavors, for instance. So we can call that street smarts, and we can also call that well-bred. So there might be social capital as access to different types of markets, but in that article, we talk about knowing the right people and how important knowing the right people becomes. And then also think a similar thing happens in terms of when we talk about discrimination next week, when we talk about getting good interest rates, social capital comes in different forms. So if you know how to advocate for yourself in getting finance, if you know the right people, if you know bankers, if you look the right way, that social capital can get you access to different types of, to like better terms on finance where discrimination comes through. It can also help you build communities of trust if that's the way enforcement works. So it's that part. The mutual aid part, I've been sending around some links about mutual aid in our city. But that mutual aid piece talks about how mutual aid works, that mutual aid isn't new. And that instead of trying to build returns, can we make more from what we have? It's simply a matter of reallocating assets so that everyone has enough, ideally, or that more people have enough. So it's not, here I wrote asset sharing is a way to think about mutual aid. Like what do we have? What do we actually own? And who needs it right now? Mutual aid is distinguished from charity because it's not an issue of somebody who has a lot, like deciding, because the difference is the mutual part. So mutual meaning that this is for all of us. So like if we have a community and we know that we will help each other out when times are hard, that applies to everyone. And that means that nobody is hoarding assets because they know that if they run out, it will eventually come back their way, and that we need to meet the most immediate needs first. This is different from charity in that charity or like philanthropy is usually done from the position of somebody who has a lot of wealth and decides themselves what is needed. So in mutual aid, people say, this is what I need, and other people say, this is what I have, or the same people, this is what I need, this is what I have, and we just match. Whereas in a charity case, there's usually not somebody saying, this is what I need. There's only somebody saying, this is what I have, and this is what I think you need. So that's the distinguishment that they're making between mutual aid and charity in that article. But I'll let that video explain it better than I can. And yeah, so for this week, write on, just like everything else, like the response paper is for back to normal. Just what is one part of all of this that you found was interesting? Explain that point on its own terms, and then describe why you agree or disagree, right? And the and why part. Let me know if you have any questions. Please throw them in the discussion board. The discussions that have been going have been really interesting, so please continue to use those. And I will talk to you next week or see you at office hours. Okay, thank you.